Growing up, I was the pride of my family. My parents, immigrants who had fought for every inch of ground they stood on, had molded me into their shining success story. Every medal I brought home, every grade report with straight A's, every moment of obedient compliance to their plans, it all reinforced my role as the golden child. And then there was Maya. Maya was 2 years younger than me, and from the time we were kids, it was clear she didn't fit the mold. She didn't care about trophies or test scores. She spent her time drawing in her sketchpad, sneaking books about art into her room, and finding ways to rebel against the strict rules of our house. My parents were relentless with her. Every missed homework assignment, every unacceptable outfit, every declaration of independence was met with lectures, punishments, and endless comparisons to me. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" they would say. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was young, and all I knew was that being good earned me their approval, while Maya's defiance brought her nothing but anger. I didn't understand how deeply those words cut her until much later. As we grew older, the gap between us widened. I was on the fast track to med school, while Maya scraped by in community college, working odd jobs to pay her bills because my parents refused to support her. "She needs to learn responsibility," they said. Responsibility, as defined by them, meant living by their rules. I didn't see it then, but Maya wasn't failing. She was surviving in a world where she'd been made to feel like she didn't belong. Our relationship was strained at best. Maya resented me, and I knew it. I could see it in the way her eyes hardened when our parents gushed over my latest accomplishment. I could hear it in her sharp tone whenever we talked. I didn't blame her, but I didn't know how to fix it, either. It wasn't until Maya moved out that the reality of our family dynamic truly hit me. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. One day, her room was just empty. My mother cried, calling her selfish and ungrateful. My father said she would come crawling back once she realized how hard life was on her own. I stayed silent, unsure of what to feel. Weeks turned into months with no word from her. My parents didn't seem concerned, but I was. I started calling her, leaving messages that went unanswered. Eventually, she texted me back, "I'm fine. Please stop trying to drag me back into that house." I didn't stop. I kept reaching out, trying to explain that I wasn't like them, that I didn't agree with how they'd treated her. Her responses were curt, guarded. "Then why didn't you say anything when it mattered?" That question haunted me. I didn't have an answer. Meanwhile, my own life was becoming increasingly suffocating. My parents were involved in every decision I made, from where I lived to the people I dated. When I introduced them to Priya, the woman I'd been seeing for almost a year, they smiled politely but made it clear she wasn't their type of girl. "She's nice," my mother said, her tone dripping with insincerity. "But don't you think you could do better? Someone who comes from a family like ours?" They never outright forbade me from being with Priya, but their disapproval hung over every interaction like a storm cloud. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my relationship, but the pressure was relentless. Things came to a head at a family gathering. It was supposed to be a celebration, my cousin was getting engaged, and the house was full of relatives. Priya had reluctantly agreed to come, even though she knew how my parents felt about her. We were barely 10 minutes in when Maya walked through the door. The room went silent. My mother's face froze in shock, while my father's jaw tightened. Maya didn't look at either of them. She walked straight to me, her chin held high. "Hey, Samir," she said, her voice steady. "Can we talk?" I nodded, too stunned to speak. We stepped into the hallway, away from the crowd. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice low. She smirked. "Relax, I'm not here to cause a scene. I just needed to see you." "For what?" "For closure," she said bluntly. "I need to say some things, and you need to hear them." I nodded, my stomach twisting. "Okay. Go ahead." Maya took a deep breath, her expression hardening. "You stood by while they treated me like garbage. You let them pit us against each other because it benefited you. Do you know what that did to me, Samir? Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up being told you're not enough, while your own brother stays silent?" I didn't know how to stop it, I admitted, my voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. "You could have tried," she snapped. "But you didn't. You just sat there, soaking up their approval while I drowned." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "I'm sorry," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "I should have done more. I should have been there for you." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, as though she'd been waiting to hear those words for years. "Apologies are a start," she said quietly. "But they're not enough. If you really want to make this right, you need to start standing up for yourself, and for Priya. Otherwise, you're just going to end up like them." Maya turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat down with my parents. I told them everything, about how their favoritism had destroyed our family, about how their control over my life was suffocating me, and about how I couldn't continue living like this. My father stared at me, his expression unreadable. My mother burst into tears, begging me not to abandon them. "I'm not abandoning you," I said firmly. "But I'm not living my life for you anymore." The conversation ended with no resolution, just a heavy silence that hung over the room like a storm cloud. Over the next few months, I made changes. I moved out of my parents' house and into an apartment with Priya. I set boundaries with my parents, refusing to let them interfere in my decisions. And I reached out to Maya, slowly rebuilding the relationship we'd lost. It wasn't easy. My parents didn't take the shift well, and there were times I wondered if I'd made the right choice. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living for myself, not for them, not for their expectations, but for me. Maya and I aren't perfect, but we're talking again. Priya and I are planning our future together. And while I'll always carry the weight of my family's influence, I'm learning how to let it go. The cost of being the golden child was high, but in the end, I found something worth even more: freedom. Update 1: Maya and I started seeing each other more regularly after that night. At first, it was cautious, like testing the waters. We met at a cafe or walked through the park, never quite diving too deep into the wreckage of our past. It felt like we were navigating a minefield, both of us afraid to set off an explosion that might ruin what little trust we had rebuilt. One afternoon, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, Maya broke the silence. "Do you remember when we used to sneak out to the roof when we were kids?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. I laughed softly. "Yeah. You were the one who always convinced me to do it. You'd say, 'Don't be such a goody-goody, Samir.'" "You were a goody-goody," she said, nudging me with her elbow. "Even back then, you couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them." Her words hung in the air, unspoken truths weaving through the spaces between us. I wanted to defend myself, to say that I wasn't just the obedient son, that I hadn't always been their pawn, but that wasn't true. I had been the golden child, basking in their approval, even when it came at her expense. "I wish I'd done things differently," I admitted, my voice low. "I should have stood up for you." Maya stared at the water, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "It wasn't just about standing up for me, Samir. It was about standing up for yourself. They had you on a leash, and you didn't even realize it." She wasn't wrong. For years, I'd been living a life they designed, convincing myself that it was what I wanted. The perfect son, the perfect student, the perfect man who never strayed from the script. But what had that perfection cost me? My relationship with my sister, the woman I loved, and, if I wasn't careful, my own sense of identity. As the days turned into weeks, I began making small but significant changes. I stopped answering every call from my parents, choosing instead to call back when I was ready. I declined their requests to visit every weekend, opting to spend that time with Priya or by myself. It felt strange at first, like breaking a lifelong habit, but it was liberating too. For the first time, I was starting to set boundaries. My parents didn't take it well. My mother cried the first time I turned down dinner, guilt-tripping me with lines like, "We sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us?" My father, ever the stoic figure, said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The real test came when Priya and I decided to move in together. It wasn't an impulsive decision. We'd been talking about it for months, but I knew it would send shockwaves through my family. Cohabitation before marriage was unthinkable to them, a betrayal of our values. I could already hear my mother's voice in my head, calling it a disgrace. When I finally told them, their reaction was as bad as I'd anticipated. "Do you have any idea what people will say?" my mother demanded, her face flushed with anger. "You're humiliating us, Samir. Priya doesn't respect our traditions, and now you're following her down this path of shame." "This isn't about shame, Ma," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's about building a life with someone I love. I'm not asking for your permission, I'm telling you what I've decided." My father, who had been silent up until then, finally spoke. "You're turning your back on everything we raised you to be," he said, his tone cold. "If you go through with this, don't expect us to support you anymore." The ultimatum was like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I hesitated, the weight of their disapproval pressing down on me. But then I thought about Maya, how she'd walked away from the same suffocating expectations, how she'd found a way to live authentically, even if it meant losing their approval. If she could do it, so could I. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said finally, my voice steady. "But I'm not changing my decision." The conversation ended with my mother in tears and my father storming out of the room. As I left their house that day, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. For the first time, I wasn't living for them, I was living for myself. Moving in with Priya felt like crossing a threshold into a new chapter of my life. It wasn't easy. My parents stopped calling altogether, and while Maya was supportive, I could tell she was wary, afraid I might fall back into old patterns. Priya, ever patient and understanding, stood by me through it all, even when I doubted myself. One night, as we sat on the couch eating takeout, I turned to her and said, "Thank you." She looked at me, puzzled. "For what?" "For being patient with me," I said. "For staying, even when I've made things so complicated." Priya smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. "You're worth it, Samir. And besides, you're finally starting to stand up for yourself. That's all I ever wanted." Her words stayed with me, a quiet reminder of how far I'd come, and how far I still had to go. Over time, my relationship with Maya grew stronger. She invited me to her art show, a small but vibrant gallery where her work was on display. As I walked through the exhibit, admiring her pieces, I felt a swell of pride, not just for her talent, but for her resilience. She'd built a life for herself, one that wasn't defined by our parents' expectations, and it was beautiful. "I'm glad you came," she said, standing beside me as I admired a painting of hers that depicted a crumbling house. "It means a lot." "I wouldn't have missed it," I said sincerely. "You're amazing, Maya." She smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt like the walls between us were finally coming down. The breakthrough with Maya gave me the courage to reach out to my parents again, not to seek their approval, but to try to find a middle ground. It wasn't easy. My mother was still hurt, my father still distant, but I made it clear that while I loved them, I wouldn't sacrifice my happiness to meet their expectations. It took months of difficult conversations, but eventually, they began to come around. They met Priya for dinner one evening, and while it was awkward, it was a step forward. I knew things wouldn't change overnight, but I also knew that change was possible. As I stood in the kitchen one morning, making coffee while Priya hummed a tune in the background, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, messy, complicated, and entirely my own. Being the golden child had come at a cost, but in the end, I'd found something worth fighting for: freedom, authenticity, and the relationships that truly mattered. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. TLDR, I grew up as the golden child in a family that suffocated me with expectations while neglecting my sibling. After years of guilt and sacrifice, I broke free, rebuilt my relationship with my sister, and chose to live life on my own terms with my partner by my side. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Story 2. The weight of being the golden child. I was 8 years old the first time I realized I wasn't just a son, I was a savior. My mother didn't phrase it like that, of course. She didn't need to. The way she spoke about me, the way she pushed my little sister, Nina, to follow my example, and the way she cried happy tears at my smallest achievements, it all told me that I was special. "You're our hope, Arjun," she would say, her hands on my cheeks, her voice thick with pride. "You'll be the one to make this family proud." Nina would sit on the floor nearby, coloring or reading, pretending not to hear. I always felt a pang of guilt when she glanced up at us, her expression unreadable. She was only 6 then, but even I could tell she understood what those words meant. She wasn't the hope. I was. By the time I was 12, the expectations were no longer subtle. My father, a man of few words, would nod approvingly when I brought home good grades, but his approval came with conditions. "You've got to keep this up, Arjun," he'd say, his tone matter of fact. "This is what we worked so hard for when we came to this country." Meanwhile, Nina struggled. She wasn't bad at school, far from it, but she wasn't me. Her report cards were filled with BS and the occasional A, marks that would have been celebrated in another family. In ours, they were met with tight smiles and murmured reassurances that she could do better. I tried to shield her when I could. If she was struggling with her homework, I'd sit with her for hours, explaining math problems or helping her practice spelling words. But no matter how much I helped, it wasn't enough to close the gap. And when my parents praised me for tutoring her, it only made things worse. "Look at your brother," my mother would say. "He's helping you because he wants you to succeed too. Why can't you try harder like him?" Nina never said anything back. She'd just nod, her face blank, and retreat to her room. As we grew older, the divide between us deepened. By the time I was in high school, I was juggling AP classes, student council, and a part-time job tutoring other kids. My parents reveled in every accolade I earned, parading my accomplishments at family gatherings like trophies. Arjun got accepted into the honors program, my father would announce, his voice filled with pride. The school even sent a letter commending his leadership skills. Nina, who had just started high school, became quieter and more withdrawn. She spent most of her time in her room, painting or sketching. Her artwork was incredible, vibrant and alive in ways that made me stop and stare. But my parents barely noticed. One day, I found her in the garage, sitting on an old stool with a canvas propped up against the wall. She was painting a stormy ocean, the waves dark and tumultuous. "That's amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. She glanced at me, her brush pausing mid-stroke. "Thanks," she said, her tone flat. "Why don't you show this to Mom and Dad?" I asked. "They'd be blown away." She snorted, shaking her head. "They wouldn't care. It's not a grade or a medal, so what's the point?" Her words stung, not because they weren't true, but because I didn't have a response. By the time I was in college, the weight of being the golden child started to feel less like pride and more like chains. I'd chosen pre-med, not because I wanted to, but because my parents had always talked about how proud they'd be if I became a doctor. My dreams, whatever they had been, were buried under layers of expectations. Meanwhile, Nina was spiraling. She barely passed her classes and dropped out of high school during her junior year. My parents were livid, their disappointment palpable in every word, every sigh, every disapproving glance. "She's ruining her life," my father said one night, his voice low and bitter. "Why can't she see how lucky she is to have these opportunities?" I wanted to defend her, to tell him that maybe she wasn't ruining her life, maybe she was just trying to live it on her own terms. But I stayed silent, the way I always did. Nina moved out a few months later, renting a tiny apartment with money she earned from a part-time job at a bookstore. She didn't tell anyone where she was going at first, but I found out through mutual friends and started visiting her whenever I could. Her apartment was cramped and cluttered, but it was filled with her paintings, each one more vibrant than the last. She seemed happier in that small space than she'd ever been at home. "Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" I asked during one of my visits. "Would it have made a difference?" she replied, her tone sharp. "You wouldn't have stopped me. You're too busy playing their perfect son." Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. "I'm not perfect," I said, my voice defensive. "No," she agreed, her gaze piercing. "But you've spent your whole life letting them think you are. Do you even know who you are, Arjun? Or are you just who they want you to be?" I didn't have an answer. Over the next few years, I tried to maintain the balancing act. I continued my pre-med studies, earning my parents' praise with every passing semester. At the same time, I kept visiting Nina, quietly supporting her in ways my parents refused to. I bought her art supplies when she couldn't afford them and attended her first gallery show, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. But no matter how hard I tried, the gap between us never fully closed. She resented me for being their favorite, and I resented myself for not doing more to change things. The breaking point came during my last year of med school. I was overwhelmed, drowning in coursework and clinical rotations, when my parents called with a familiar request. "Can you talk to Nina?" my mother asked, her voice tight with frustration. "She's refusing to come to your cousin's wedding. It's embarrassing for the family." I sighed, exhausted. "Maybe she doesn't want to come, Ma. Did you ever think of that? It's not about what she wants," she snapped. "It's about the family. She's making us look bad." I hung up without answering. That night, I drove to Nina's apartment. She opened the door, her expression wary. "What's up?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I'm tired," I said, collapsing onto her couch. "Tired of all of it?" She raised an eyebrow, sitting down across from me. "All of what?" "Being the golden child," I admitted, my voice cracking. "Living my life for them. Pretending like I've got it all together when I don't." Nina stared at me, her expression softening. "You're serious?" "Yeah," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't even know who I am anymore, Nina. I don't know if I ever did." For the first time in years, we talked, really talked. About our childhood, about the ways our parents had shaped us, and about the people we wanted to be. It was raw and painful, but it was also healing. In the months that followed, I made changes. I switched my residency focus from surgery, my parents' dream, to family medicine, something I actually cared about. I stopped trying to mediate between Nina and my parents, letting her set her own boundaries. It wasn't perfect, far from it. My parents were furious when they found out about my residency change, and their relationship with Nina remained strained. But for the first time, I felt like I was living my own life, not just the one they'd mapped out for me. Nina's second gallery show was a huge success. As I stood in the crowd, watching her smile as people admired her work, I felt a swell of pride, not because she was following my example, but because she was forging her own path. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the golden child. I just felt like her brother. TLDR, I grew up as the golden child in a family that unfairly favored me over my sister, Nina. Over the years, the weight of their expectations took its toll on both of us, straining our relationship. It wasn't until I confronted my own role in the dynamic and started living for myself that I was able to rebuild my bond with Nina and begin healing from the damage of our upbringing. Story 3, my sister Aisha was always the golden child, adored by everyone while I lived in her shadow. When people talk about my sister, Aisha, their eyes light up like they're talking about the sun itself. She's dazzling, radiant, and impossible to ignore. Growing up, it didn't matter what she did, winning school competitions, performing piano recitals, or simply walking into a room, everyone gravitated toward her. My parents used to joke that she was their golden child, but it wasn't really a joke, was it? She was their pride, their joy, their shining star. And me? I was there. I don't remember a time when I wasn't compared to her. Aisha was older by 2 years, just enough of a gap that she was always 2 steps ahead of me. When I brought home a decent grade, my parents would nod politely, then remind me of the time Aisha aced the same test and got a special award for it. When I joined the soccer team, they said, "That's great. You know, Aisha was captain of her team by the time she was your age." It wasn't that they didn't love me, I think they did, in their own way, but their love for Aisha was louder. It filled the room, leaving little space for me. One memory stands out more than the rest. I was 8 years old, and it was my school's open house. I had worked so hard on my art project, a cardboard diorama of the solar system. I couldn't wait to show my parents. But when they arrived, they barely glanced at it. My mom clapped politely, saying, "Oh, that's nice, Noor," before turning to my dad. "Did you hear? Aisha's teacher says she's going to be the valedictorian someday." And just like that, my little solar system faded into the background. As I got older, I learned to keep my expectations low. When Aisha was home, the spotlight was hers. Even on the rare occasions when I achieved something big, a trophy, a promotion, a personal victory, it always felt like it was measured against her brilliance. "That's amazing, Noor," my dad would say. "You're really following in Aisha's footsteps." I wasn't following in her footsteps. I was trying to make my own. The truth is, Aisha wasn't just good at everything, she was perfect. She was beautiful, smart, kind, and generous. Everyone loved her, and she loved everyone back. It made it impossible to hate her, even when I wanted to. And I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But how do you hate someone who's never done anything wrong? Aisha wasn't cruel. She didn't lord her achievements over me. In fact, she went out of her way to encourage me, which almost made it worse. "You're so talented, Noor," she'd say, her voice full of sincerity. "Don't sell yourself short." How could I explain to her that her kindness felt like a spotlight I couldn't escape? That her very existence cast a shadow so wide, I couldn't find my way out of it? The breaking point came last year. Aisha had just gotten engaged to her longtime boyfriend, Arman, and my parents were over the moon. They threw an extravagant engagement party, inviting everyone we'd ever met. The house was filled with laughter, music, and glowing compliments for Aisha and Arman. I was happy for her, truly. But as I stood in the corner, watching her glide through the crowd like she was born to be adored, something inside me cracked. I tried to shake it off, but then my mom pulled me aside. "Can you help Aisha with the seating arrangements?" she asked. "She's a bit overwhelmed, and you're so good at these little details." Little details. That's what I was to them, a background character in Aisha's story. "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice trembling, "I'm not really in the mood. Maybe someone else can help." My mom blinked at me, surprised. "Noor, don't be difficult. This is your sister's big day." "It's always her big day," I snapped. The words spilled out before I could stop them. My mom stared at me like I'd slapped her, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of triumph. But it didn't last. She sighed, her face softening. "Noor, you know we're proud of you too, right? But Aisha, she's special. She's worked so hard for everything she's achieved. Can't you just be happy for her?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. After the party, I retreated to my room, avoiding everyone. I told myself I was being childish, that I should just let it go. But the resentment I'd buried for years was clawing its way to the surface, and I didn't know how to stop it. The next morning, Aisha knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant. I nodded, even though I didn't want to. She sat on the edge of my bed, her usual confidence replaced with something quieter, almost nervous. "Noor," she began, "I know things haven't always been easy between us." I laughed bitterly. "You think?" She flinched but didn't argue. "I never wanted to make you feel like you were less than me. If I've done that, I'm sorry." Her apology caught me off guard. "It's not your fault," I said, my voice cracking. "It's not about you, Aisha. It's about them. They've spent our whole lives putting you on a pedestal, and I'm tired of trying to climb up to where you are." She looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt. "I didn't ask to be on a pedestal, Noor. I don't want to be up there." Her words stunned me. "What do you mean?" "I mean it's exhausting," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to their expectations, to be perfect. But I'm not perfect. I'm just really good at pretending." For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor. "I never wanted to overshadow you," she said softly. "I just wanted to make them proud." Her honesty broke something in me, but it also healed something too. For the first time, I realized we were both victims of the same system. My parents had cast me in the role of the forgotten one, but they'd cast her in a role too, the golden child who could never fail. It didn't fix everything overnight. There were still years of resentment to work through, and our parents didn't suddenly change their ways. But Aisha and I started talking more, leaning on each other instead of letting our parents' expectations drive us apart. A few months later, at her wedding, she asked me to be her maid of honor. When I stood beside her, holding her bouquet and watching her smile at Armin, I didn't feel like I was in her shadow anymore. For the first time, I felt like her sister. TLDR, my sister Aisha was always the golden child, adored by everyone while I lived in her shadow. Years of favoritism strained our relationship, but after an emotional confrontation, I realized we were both struggling under our parents' expectations. We're rebuilding our bond, one step at a time.